Here's a number that ought to stop you cold before you even finish reading this sentence. McDonald's Corporation pulls in more money from rent checks every year. Picture this. You pull into the parking lot at 6:47 in the morning, and the smell hits you before you've even opened the car door. Coffee, hash browns, that unmistakable McDonald's smell that hasn't changed since you were a kid riding in the back seat. You unlock the front door yourself. Your name is on the lease. The logo overhead technically isn't yours, but everything inside this building is. The fryers, the registers, the payroll, the thick binder of operating procedures sitting in the back office. That's all you know. You sank $1 million, maybe more, and a solid decade of your working life into getting to this point. You own a McDonald's, except you don't. Not the part that actually matters. And by the time this video's done, you're never going to look at a drive-through line the same way again. Because underneath those golden arches, McDonald's isn't really running the business most people assume it's running. It's running a completely different business, one that has almost nothing to do with beef patties or special sauce. And once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. Let's start by pulling apart the word McDonald's itself, because it's carrying a lot more weight than people give it credit for. McDonald's isn't one business. It's at least three, all wearing the same uniform, all standing under the same sign, and almost nobody outside the industry realizes they're actually separate operations. There's the franchisee, the person who's up at 5 a.m., managing a crew of 40 teenagers, arguing with a produce supplier over the state of the lettuce, and genuinely losing sleep over beef prices the way a Midwest farmer loses sleep over rain. There's McDonald's Corporation, the brand and systems company, the entity licensing out 70 years of playbooks, training programs, supplier relationships, and marketing muscle that no independent restaurant owner could ever build from scratch on their own. And then there's a third player almost nobody thinks about while they're ordering a Big Mac, McDonald's the Landlord. A real estate operation sitting on tens of thousands of properties, many of them on some of the most valuable commercial corners in the country. The kind of intersections that gas station chains, pharmacy chains, and regional banks quietly fight over for years before somebody finally wins the lease. When people hear franchise, they picture that first business, the American dream story, sweat equity turning into a family legacy. But the company's own books tell a very different story, one where that quiet third business, the landlord business, has actually been running the show for the better part of 70 years. So let's talk about what it actually costs to get in the door, because the sticker price is already playing a little sleight of hand before you've signed a thing. To open a single McDonald's, you're looking at somewhere between $1 million and $2.3 million in total investment, and that's before you've handed a single customer a single fry. The franchise fee itself, the amount paid straight to corporate for the legal right to use the brand and the system for a 20-year term, is a comparatively modest $45,000. Next to everything else you're about to spend, that fee is basically a rounding error. It's the cover charge, not the real bill. The real bill shows up afterward. Construction or renovation of the building, which in expensive urban markets alone can blow well past $1 million. Kitchen equipment, the fryers, the grills, the soft-serve machines that seem to be broken in every location in America at the exact same time, a running joke at this point. Signage, which at this scale is regulated, pricey, and completely non-negotiable in its design. Initial inventory. And a required minimum in liquid capital, usually cited around $500,000 of your own cash, not borrowed, because McDonald's doesn't want you financing your way into this deal entirely on debt. They want proof you can survive a genuinely bad 6 months without the whole thing collapsing under you. Compare that to the rest of the fast food landscape, and the contrast tells you something. A Subway can, in some formats, get off the ground for under $200,000. A Dunkin' typically lands somewhere in the mid-six figures to just over $1 million, depending on the format and the market. McDonald's sits at the very top of that range on purpose. That high floor isn't an accident of inflation, it's a filter. It weeds out anyone who can't operate at real institutional scale, and just as importantly, it weeds out anyone who might, 6 months in, miss a payment to the party about to become the single most important relationship in their entire business life, their landlord. And that word, landlord, is where this story actually turns, and where most people's mental picture of McDonald's quietly falls apart. Because in the overwhelming majority of cases, McDonald's Corporation either owns the land outright or holds a long-term master lease on it, then subleases that same piece of ground back to you, the franchisee, at a markup. You're not simply paying for the right to sell hamburgers under a globally recognized name. You're paying commercial rent, real, monthly, contractually enforced rent, to a landlord who also happens to be your franchisor, your supply chain, and your brand licensor, all rolled into one signature on one set of documents. In various years, that landlord has ranked among the largest real estate holders on the planet, with a property portfolio bigger, by both square footage and book value, than most publicly traded real estate investment trusts, whose entire corporate purpose is owning commercial property. Sit with that for a second. The company most people describe as a fast food chain owns more valuable commercial real estate, by some measures, than companies whose whole business model is owning commercial real estate. This double role, landlord and franchisor at once, creates a timing mismatch most new owners don't really feel until somewhere around year 2, once the initial rush of ownership wears off and the spreadsheet starts telling the truth instead of the brochure. Your revenue is seasonal, and it's daily. A grey, slow Tuesday in February looks nothing like a Saturday before a long holiday weekend. Foot traffic swings with the weather, with the school calendar, with whether there's road construction blocking the turn lane into your lot. 100 variables completely outside your control. But your two biggest fixed costs, rent and equipment financing, don't care what kind of Tuesday you're having. Rent is due on the 1st, every month. Equipment payments are due on schedule, good year or bad. Franchisees describe a very particular dread that builds around this over time. The deposits hitting the account are unpredictable, tracking the weather and the local economy that week. The rent withdrawal is fixed, scheduled, and doesn't budge, whether the last 2 weeks brought a heat wave that killed your afternoon traffic or a nearby layoff that quietly cut into how many families were eating out that month. The rent check clears exactly the same either way. So if rent isn't officially the headline cost in the disclosure paperwork you sign at the start, where's McDonald's actual revenue engine really coming from? Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly before the signature goes on the page. A franchisee typically pays the corporation 3 separate revenue streams, stacked on top of each other. First, a flat royalty, generally cited around 4% of gross sales, a cut off everything the register rings up, regardless of what food and labor costs did that month. Second, the initial franchise fee, spread out over the full 20-year license. And third, the big one, the one that rarely gets the same airtime as the brand story at orientation, rent. That rent is very often structured not as a flat monthly figure, but as a base amount plus a percentage of total sales, frequently landing around 8.5% of gross revenue stacked on top of the base. Put those three together and rent alone can dwarf the royalty in raw dollars. In its own financial filings over the years, McDonald's rental income from franchised restaurants has represented a share of total corporate revenue that genuinely surprises people who still reflexively call it a burger company. The burgers are the product on the menu board. The real estate is the actual engine underneath it, quietly generating the returns that make the stock attractive to institutional investors who've never once stood behind a McDonald's counter. Which brings us to the mechanism most franchisees don't fully grasp until it's too late to matter, the structural trap sitting quietly under every single location's books, whether that location is thriving or barely hanging on. Because McDonald's controls the underlying land at the vast majority of its locations, the franchise agreement typically runs a 20-year term, and critically, it's renewable at McDonald's discretion, not guaranteed as a matter of right. Read that twice, because it's the whole ballgame. If a location underperforms. If a franchisee falls behind on rent or royalties during a rough stretch through no real fault of their own, or if the corporation simply decides a particular piece of land is now worth far more redeveloped into something else entirely, a different retailer, a mixed-use project, a straight sale to a developer, the franchisee's entire business, the one they poured over $1 million and a decade of 70-hour weeks into, can lose its lease on the ground it's physically standing on. The franchisee owns the building improvements. They own the operating business, the goodwill built up with regulars over the years, the systems refined through trial and error during a rush they never saw coming. They almost never own the dirt underneath it. That single fact is the load-bearing wall of the whole relationship, and it's why McDonald's has historically held enormous leverage in disputes with individual operators, even ones who've run successful stores for decades. You can, in theory, fire your restaurant manager and bring in someone new. It's a lot harder to simply walk away from your landlord when that landlord is also your brand license, your supply chain, and your main source of customer traffic, all bundled into one counterparty sitting across the table from you. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, because none of this was the original plan. It was, in fact, a fix for a company that was quietly failing. The story that best explains how this whole system got built doesn't start with Ray Kroc flipping burgers. It starts with a struggling finance guy named Harry Sonneborn, and a business that, by the early 1950s, was expanding fast on paper while barely staying afloat in reality. In the early years of Kroc's franchising push, restaurants were opening steadily and plenty of franchisees were doing just fine for themselves, but Kroc's own cut, a thin royalty skimmed off each location's sales, barely covered the parent company's overhead. The brand was growing in name recognition. The company running it was not getting rich, and by some accounts was closer to going under than most people would guess today. Sonneborn, brought in specifically to help fix the company's dire cash situation, looked at the whole operation and told Kroc, in essence, you're not really in the food business. You're in the real estate business. You just haven't set yourself up that way yet. That single insight became Franchise Realty Corporation, founded in the mid-1950s. Instead of simply licensing the brand and collecting a thin royalty, the new structure had McDonald's scout prime locations itself, lease or buy the land using the parent company's own credit and negotiating muscle, build or finance the restaurant, and then sublease the whole package, land, building, brand rights, everything, to individual franchisees at a markup over what McDonald's itself was paying underneath it all. Almost overnight, on paper, McDonald's went from a thin margin brand licensor teetering on the edge to a landlord collecting guaranteed rent from thousands of independently run small businesses at once, month after month, no matter how any single store's food costs happened to be trending. By the time McDonald's went public in the mid-1960s, this real estate engine, not the razor-thin margin sitting on top of any individual hamburger, had become the real financial backbone letting the company scale worldwide, while franchisees absorbed nearly all the day-to-day risk. The labor shortages, the sudden beef price spikes, the new competitor opening across the street. It's arguably the single most consequential structural decision in the history of American fast food, and the vast majority of people ordering a McFlurry at midnight have never once heard the name Harry Sonneborn. So why do experienced, financially savvy operators, people who've read every page of the disclosure documents and understand exactly how the rent structure works against them in a bad year, still line up for this deal, year after year, decade after decade, knowing full well the land was never theirs and never will be? Because for the right kind of operator, a McDonald's isn't really a bet on hamburgers at all. It's a leveraged bet on a brand carrying unmatched consumer trust, backed by one of the most sophisticated site selection and real estate research operations in all of retail, built over 70 years and refined with more traffic data than most city planning departments have access to. McDonald's doesn't pick corners at random. Its real estate arm has spent decades building traffic pattern models, demographic forecasting tools, and site selection systems most small business owners could never afford to build on their own, even with unlimited capital. Buying into that system means buying into decades of institutional knowledge about exactly which intersection, in exactly which growing suburb, will still be pulling strong traffic 15 years down the road, long after the strip mall around it has been remodeled twice. Multi-unit operators, the franchisees who eventually run 10, 20, sometimes 60 locations across a whole region, use the predictable, contractually locked-in cash flow from their existing stores as collateral to borrow for further expansion, whether that means buying more locations from retiring owners or funding ventures entirely outside the brand. Well-known operator families across the country have built nine-figure fortunes not off any single restaurant's thin food margins, but off the combined, de-risked cash flow of owning dozens of units at once, cash flow that behaves, to a lender, almost like a bond coupon, predictable enough to borrow against at rates a standalone independent restaurant owner could never qualify for. And McDonald's Corporation benefits enormously from the whole arrangement, precisely because rental income is locked in contractually, no matter how any given franchisee's food costs, labor costs, or local competition happen to swing month to month. For the parent company, sitting comfortably above thousands of operators absorbing individual risk, it's about as close as you get to guaranteed, recurring income anywhere in retail, closer, in its predictability, to a commercial mortgage portfolio than to a restaurant chain. Now here's the number that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the part almost nobody sees coming until after they've signed. Picture two versions of the exact same 2,800 square foot McDonald's. Same market, same year, same drive-through lane, same regional customer base, just two different sets of circumstances playing out. In the good year, gross sales land around $3.2 million. Food and paper costs eat roughly a third of that. Labor takes another quarter. The royalty skims its 4% right off the top, no negotiation. Rent, base amount plus the percentage of sales piece, takes close to 10% combined. After utilities, insurance and equipment payments, the franchisee nets somewhere around $250,000 to $300,000 before they've even paid themselves a salary out of that. A genuinely good year, the kind they show prospective franchisees during recruitment. In the bad year, that same location tells a much darker story, one that rarely makes it into any brochure. A regional minimum wage hike collides with a beef price spike caused by drought somewhere in cattle country 1,000 miles away. Nearby road construction cuts off easy access to the drive-thru for 4 straight months during peak season. That store does $2.7 million instead of $3.2. A real, painful drop, but from the parking lot it still looks, to any outside observer, plenty busy. Except rent and royalty are both calculated as fixed percentages of gross revenue, not profit, so they barely budge relative to that smaller sales number underneath them. Labor, meanwhile, is stickier than sales. You can't just cut half your kitchen staff, because sales dipped 18%, not without service falling apart and driving off the customers you've still got. The franchisee's net income for the year can collapse to $60,000, or slide into the red entirely, even though the store looks just as busy as it did the year before. The corporation's rent check in both years, without exception, clears. That's the whole relationship in one sentence. Your income is variable, theirs is fixed. And they designed it that way on purpose 70 years ago, long before either of you were born. So strip away the fries, strip away the golden arches, strip away the Happy Meal boxes and the playgrounds and 70 years of jingles most of us can still hum without trying, and here's the sentence that actually explains McDonald's as a business, the one you'll remember long after you've forgotten everything else here. The burgers pay the franchisee's bills, but the land pays McDonald's shareholders. Every single location, structurally, from the smallest rural drive-thru to the busiest urban flagship, is a landlord's proposition wearing a fast food uniform. Next time you're sitting in that drive-thru line, half watching the person handing you your coffee through the window, think about what's actually happening underneath that transaction. They're not just working thin margins on a hash brown. Somewhere behind them, in a spreadsheet they may never personally see, their entire business is making a rent payment on some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the country to a company that figured out 7 decades ago that the fastest way to build a global empire wasn't selling more hamburgers. It was owning the ground underneath everyone else's.